The smooth finish on a plastic or resin vehicle kit can be very boring. So in this segment, I'm going to demonstrate how to create the look of forged steel plating using a German tank. Alright, to create the texture, I'm going to need my Dremel with a fine point burr. I'm going to need some white putty, some liquid plastic cement, that's methyl ethyl ketone or MEK, an old toothbrush, and a couple pieces of fine grained sandpaper. The first thing I'm going to do is take the Dremel and create some divots. We'll do that now. Alright, I'm going to do this by working in small sections. You want to create divots that are different shapes, so coming in from a different angle, and different sizes. You don't need a lot of them, just a few will do. But I recommend working on a couple of different small sections at a time so that you are less likely to create patterns or create your divots in a line. You'll notice they also roughed up the edge here a little bit, just to give it a little more texture. I'm going to finish creating the divots, and we'll move on to the next step with the putty. Okay, I have finished creating the divots and scratches. You can see I've also added some lines here. They're not very heavy. Also done with the Dremel, just to get some imperfections that are under the surface after we add the putty. I'm going to take the soft brush here, run it over each of those imperfections, just to clean it up a little bit. You can see I did go a little heavier here on the base of the hull, where you're going to get a little more chipping, particularly along the seams, the weld lines there. So I clean that up. I'm also going to take my sandpaper to some of the heavier spots, smooth that out. What you don't want are little burrs left over. So the finished effect should be reasonably subtle. It's going to be a little more obvious against the raw plastic here. This is my extra fine sandpaper. I'm going very, very gently. Doesn't matter if I leave a little bit of texture on the surface of my model, because we're going to go over much of that anyway with the putty. So this is cleaned up, smoothed out. You can see we already start to get a slightly more interesting texture just right there. Just a little bit of imperfection before we add the putty. So let's do that. Alright, and now it's texture putty time. I'm going to use my white putty, my MEK paintbrush, and I also have here a spare bit of paper that I'm going to mix this on. The white putty and the MEK both require a well-ventilated area, so make sure that you have ventilation before you start doing any of this. I am going to put a generous dollop of white putty on here. And then I'm going to pull some of that down, make a little divot, at which point I will start adding MEK to it just to thin it out a bit, working in batches. Stipple that around with my brush. You want the white putty to be nice and soft. That's what the MEK helps with. And I am going to, again working in small batches, very gently stipple this on. One of the nice things about having an old brush like this is I don't have to worry about it, but it also has a nice uneven random texture to it as it goes on the surface. You'll notice I'm rotating the brush between applications. This helps avoid the pattern that might be created otherwise by the brush. Big spots like that you want to avoid, but what you can do is come back with the sandpaper in a bit. Too much on my brush, get some of that off. That's the basic idea. I'm going to smooth that out when it's cured. I'll go ahead and give it a bit of a sanding. Make sure it's not too rough, because you're looking for a subtle texture here. I'm going to finish that up, and I'll come back and I'll show you the finished piece. Okay, at this point I've covered the entire model. It's very light, a little heavier in some spots than in others, but you can see I've got some areas where the texture is a bit heavy. So all I'm going to do is come in and very gently sand that down. Just to clear out the worst of the raised sections. You want a nice subtle texture. Anything that stands up a little too high, sand that bad boy down. So that's the next step, is actually just sanding the entire model. I'll go in, do my best to avoid all the detail, sand around it, get it cleaned up. So I'll finish that. But before I do, I want to talk about doing this when you do this to a model. You want to do this before you apply any of the stowage. For instance, I've got some anti-ditching beams that are going to go on here. I've got some spare road wheels that are going to go on the back. I want to make sure I've done all of my texture prior to adding any stowage or any additional detail, only because you don't want to have it obscured or get the putty on those pieces. So next up, I'll show you the finished piece before I prime it. Okay, I've cleaned up the texture. You can see it's all reasonably flat. I've got a nice texture though, some real grit. You can see it's just ever so slightly rough. The last thing I'm going to do before I prime is actually take some canned air. Blast it primarily in the areas where you know that there are seams, panel lines. You can see it cleaning out. And you want to do that before you prime so you don't lock anything in place. And also so nothing comes off later, because you don't want to have paint start flaking off as the putty underneath it comes off. So this way I've got all my panel lines back. And you can see I got the texture even on the side hull here between the road wheels. Even though that's going to be largely obscured by mud, I generally recommend that you get every surface covered, just because somebody might see it. You might change your mind if I decide not to go heavy mud here. It's going to be too late to come back later after it's painted. So there it is. Let's go get some primer on it and I'll show you the finished piece. Alright, and here we are with the finished result. I've used a gray sandable primer. Sandable because I might need to come back and smooth something out. And gray, well, because it's the only sandable primer color that I've got, but also because the model is going to be painted gray when it's finished. So I wasn't too worried about it. But you can already see, now that everything is painted, you can really start to see how fine and subtle the texture can be. How you get that slightly rough appearance, and that'll hold true even when it's fully painted. There you go. And here's another look at a finished section with some paint on it. As always, if you have a question, drop an email to misterjustin@secretweaponminiatures.com and I'll see what I can do to help. Thanks so much for watching.